Hello, everyone. It is 6 o'clock straight up. I am hoping everyone that's watching this is doing so from someplace that is warm and dry because winter in Nebraska sucks. I'm Karen Hasse. This is Steve Williams. This is Bobby Truey. Together we are the KSB of KSB School Law. This webinar is designed for brand new board members, but if you are a veteran board member and you're listening in, we want to welcome you. If this is your first time using Zoom, or if you're using Zoom on a home computer because the weather forced you to reschedule your board meeting, I want to give you one little tip on making sure that this, what your screen looks like is what you want to see. If you look in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a little thing that says Gallery View. If you don't want to see all the participants, you can scroll down until you get to the lovely view of Karen, Steve, and Bobby. And then in the upper right-hand corner of that, you can click on the three little dots where it says Pin Video. And then hopefully what your screen will show is a slide deck that right now says 5 things every new board member needs to know. And then to the side of that, or in the corner of that, pictures of, or a live video of the three of us looking ever so stellar in our various stages of KSB casual wear. We are recording this. I will edit the recording together tonight so that we'll have the whole thing in one long loop, and then we'll have each little subsection also parceled out. That'll be up on the website, and the talented and lovely Sherry Russell will send links out to that to everyone who's participating. I think that's the end of like the original or the organizational technological stuff. If you do have any tech issues, let us know. One of the things that Bobby, your clicker's not working. One of the reasons we wanted to do this webinar was because if you're a new board member, we're your lawyers, and we don't get a chance to meet you as you start off in the school board member business. And so we wanted to have you have a chance to put names with faces and the identity of our law firm with who we are. We also have been doing this for a long time, some of us longer than others. And so these are the questions that board members most typically have when they first start as a board member. So what we've done is we've picked the 5 things that people most often have questions about. And we're going to go through those in a quick, fast, hard-hitting switch. Swapped. No, click the other clicker. All right, we'll just have to push it. So we started out years ago. We broke off from a big law firm, and we started out with just Karen, Steve, and Bobby. We, this past year, have added 2 new attorneys. Cody Pruitt and Mandy Grulke are on the screen in the picture to what would be your left. And then Sherry Russell is our paralegal and office manager, who you've probably heard from. And then Matt Russell is our office coordinator, who kind of wrangles us and drives us and tells us when to go places and what to do. Last thing we want to let you know is that we are going to take quick little breaks during the next 50 minutes. But this is so much more interesting if we're answering your questions rather than just blabbing along. I love this webinar technology. I think it's the way to the future. I think it saves boards money and it keeps you home instead of having to take a day off work. But it can get kind of boring, and it can be frustrating if you have questions that don't get answered. So this is Steve's cell phone number. He's the designated text receiver tonight. So if you've got questions as we go, shoot those questions via text message to Steve-O, and then the 3 of us, well, the old man will figure out how to look at his text messages, and then the 3 of us will answer them. So that's the end of the sort of throat clearing, getting started part of the show. So here's the 5 things we're going to talk about tonight. These are 5 things that we see new board members be frustrated by as they come onto the board. We're going to start with parliamentary procedure and say a bunch of rude things about Robert's Rules of Order. We're going to talk about the basics of how to get in and out of closed session, which is way more complicated than it should be, but the unicameral has made it that way. I'm going to tell you that you don't have to title the house in your wife's name or your husband's name because it's pretty rare that you have personal liability as a board, but we'll talk about that. Fourthly, we're going to talk about patron complaints, because I'm sure all of you are in districts where nobody ever has any complaints, but sometimes we do get phone calls from people that have patrons with complaints. And then we're going to finish up by doing a little bit on your roles and responsibilities as a board member. So that's the game plan. The reason I have this cartoon for this slide is that one of the things we get over and over again is, hey, Karen, you said we should do X, but the school district down the road does it in this other way. Or I was on a board before, I've been on the county commissioner's board or a church board or a foundation board, and why is this different? And I guess I want to start out by asking you to suspend some of your preconceived notions about what it's like to serve on a board, because the Open Meetings Act governs school boards in a way that's distinct from some of the experiences you may have had serving on other boards. The Open Meetings Act is a pretty tight section of the statutes. It's 1408 through 1414. Basically, what this law says is that anything you do as a school board, those decisions have to be made in public in the view of anybody that wants to come and watch. And this is straight out of the statute. It says every meeting of a public body shall be open to the public so that citizens can exercise their democratic privilege of attending and speaking, unless there's an exception for why you can do things in private or away from the view of the public. One of the things I do want you to know as a new board member, if you intentionally violate the Open Meetings Act, if you decide, hey, screw that, Karen, I'm going to go into closed session to talk about the basketball coach and we're not going to tell him because we just suck this year and we need to figure out a way to make the coach play man instead of zone. Understand that if you willingly and intentionally violate the Open Meetings Act, you're technically committing a crime. Class 3 misdemeanor. We have not had in the 20 years that Steve and I have been doing this, I don't think we've had a board member criminally prosecuted, but we have had the Attorney General's office threaten it. So you can't just say this is stupid, I'm going to ignore it, because you face potential criminal liability as a board member. This is a hot link to the sections, to the part of the statutes. It's only 8 statutes. Our advice is to read them. If I was a new school board member, I would sit down and read them. Even if you're not a lawyer, you don't have experience in reading statutes, they're not that hard to read through. Every one of you, if you're sitting in your board meeting room right now, should have a poster on the wall that has them up on the wall. So you should be able to get to them fairly easily. When in doubt, do everything in a meeting in open session, because you almost can never get in trouble for doing things in open session.
Okay, and so on to the specifics of parliamentary procedure. So the good news is there is very little guidance in the actual Open Meetings Act about what is required of a board in terms of how the meeting is to proceed. So I think that explains a little bit of the natural tendency to want to find some order where there is otherwise chaos, which isn't necessarily in the board's best interest. So we'll talk about a couple of cases, but in general, I think that we do celebrate it as good news that you get to proceed how you want to, for the most part. There's not a lot of restrictions. And most importantly, there is absolutely no requirement. I don't care how many people tell you that there is. I don't care how many other boards follow Robert's rules. That is not required by Nebraska law. So it's probably a question we get at least once a month because, well, I heard that John is going to call the question before Susie can go off on her tirade. Well, that's great, but it doesn't apply.
This is sort of frustrating for those of you who are like me, who I won an award in FBLA in high school because I knew parliamentary procedure rules. I know those FFA kids are like the bomb on Parli Pro. That's awesome, but that skill set is not necessary for a school board.
But you have to check your policies. So there are some policies out there that straight up say, we are going to follow parliamentary procedure. So I just grabbed, this is from Lincoln Public Schools. If you've ever had the privilege, or if you're ever in Lincoln and want to flip to channel 5 in your hotel room, it'll definitely put you to sleep. They will show the Lincoln Board of Education proceeding, and obviously, you know, they have had some contentious meetings recently, and for one reason or another, at some point, they decided to say that we are governed by Robert's Rules of Order. One of the interesting parts is they say by Robert's Rules of Order, the latest edition. Because if your policy just says by Robert's Rules of Order, that's not the version, you know, when you were in high school, maybe that is the current Robert's Rules. So by last check, it's somewhere near 1,000 pages or more now.
It's horrible.
And so if you decide to be governed by that, you're literally going to have more procedural governance than if you adopted a policy service that's out there. You're going to have more pages of governance because of Robert's rules than you will of actual policy. So it is possible. Make sure before you just say, oh, we don't have to follow that, you go and check your policy. And I think if it's in there, I'd have a discussion at your board level about whether we actually comply with that, one, but whether we actually want to say that we're governed by Robert's rules. So it's not required. This is what the actual Open Meetings Act says. Any action taken on a question or motion duly moved and seconded. So that's all that it discusses with respect to how we take action as a board on any question or motion duly moved and seconded. Once that happens, it shall be by roll call vote. So you will not be voting by aye and nay. That's just not how it works. It's required to be roll call vote. There are electronic voting procedures if you want to essentially have a big screen in your boardroom that shows everybody's vote like they do at the unicameral. Your light is either red or green. You can do that. They added that to the statute. But in general, the other time that it talks about taking votes and specific action of the board, really, we'll talk about when we get to closed session, because the vote to hold a closed session must be taken in open session. But again, no more guidance on what it means to take action. Okay, so what is required in terms of how your meeting proceeds? Definitely not Robert's rules and what it says about setting an agenda, but every item that the board is going to either discuss or take action on and consider in any way must be listed on the agenda. It must be listed with sufficient specificity to allow members of the public to know what you're going to talk about. So that's really the only legal standard you have in terms of setting the agenda. You cannot add items or amend the agenda later than 24 hours before the meeting. So those of you that are experienced board members that approve your agenda at every meeting, that's a bit of a kind of a folly, because you can't change it even if you disagreed with it. You can skip items, right? But you can't add anything and you can't change anything when you get to the board meeting that night. So don't approve your agenda because to that extent, it's a ceremonial process. But how Robert's rules, if you try to follow them, can mess you up. That one exactly. The idea of there's a motion to approve or amend the agenda, which is not lawful. You divide things up, and I know that every board out there is guilty of this to some extent. If we ran the world, it'd just be a list of stuff you're going to do, and it wouldn't be divided into these subcategories. You'll consent agenda, action item, discussion item, old business, new business. None of that stuff is actually listed in the Open Meetings Act. So those are all limitations you put on yourself, some of which come from Robert's rules. And I get the organizational structure, but those first two bullet points are really all you need to know in terms of setting an agenda.
A lot of you use an online system for agendas called Spark. The School Boards Association has put this software out, and we really like Spark. I do not like that Spark divides things up and it actually cues you and forces you to say whether something is an action item or a discussion item. And the reason I don't like that is if you've labeled something discussion and you take action on it, like if under the open meetings law, if it's on the agenda, you can do whatever you want. But if you've labeled it discussion, I'm worried that somebody's going to show up next month and say, oh, wait, I would have shown if I known you were going to take action, but you tricked me by saying it was a discussion item. So that's why our job is to give you as many options to do what you want as possible, which is to put as few constraints on you as possible. And that's why we don't like that.
Second thing you have to know about what is required, all board action must be done in a clearly stated motion. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but there's nothing that says who has to make them, how it has to come about, but you must act on either a question or a motion duly made and seconded. So we follow the keep it simple, stupid principle to the extent that you can. You want to make sure that it's easy to understand. The AG has found that boards essentially have violated the requirements of clarity of emotion, and in particular how they record it in the minutes when it starts to get really convoluted, because unless you've got a scrivener who's actually taking it down word for word, it's not going to be reflected accurately. So Robert's rules can mess this up because we get this question all the time. Well, I'm the president, so I can't make or second a motion. That's not true, right? It might be true under Robert's rules, but it's not true at a school board meeting in the state of Nebraska. So the board president could make a motion, could second a motion, and can do a lot of the things that otherwise might be limited under a different procedural setup. Amendment rules and limits on when discussion occurs and ends, those sort of things about how we can amend, how many steps you have to go, march through the candy cane forest before you can modify the friendly, which modify the procedural, which modify the technical. That crap just doesn't apply. So you're limiting yourself in terms of how you accurately reflect what's happened by saying we have to jump through those hurdles. We'll talk briefly about the Creighton decision, because one of the things that happened in this case was a motion was made, and it was essentially to go into closed session to discuss a variety of things. But what the board did is had a good conversation about, well, some of these might be appropriate, some of them might be inappropriate reasons to go. You know, I've been to one of those trainings where they told us, these are the reasons, maybe we should pull out our policy. So through discussion at the meeting, which happened to be recorded, and so it was easy to review what actually happened, they had a good discussion. I think actually got as close as you probably could have in those circumstances to getting the law on closed sessions right. The problem was the motion that was actually stated wasn't the one that ended up being everybody's understanding when they were all said and done. And so what the Attorney General said in that case is, it's great. I think it's awesome, basically, that the board discussed that. But the fact that there was no amended motion stated which clarified the board's position, that was the problem. Not the process, not the discussion, but it wasn't clear what the actual motion was at the end of the board's discussion. So to make it accurate and to record it in the minutes, make sure that you, even if you do discuss and modify a motion, it doesn't have to be through a request to modify or anything, just somebody restate it, right? And so in particular for closed session, when the actual wording has to be specific, you got to make sure that it's stated clearly, even if your procedure for amending the motion, you know, wasn't all that clear. Formal decisions must be made by roll call vote in open session. Open meetings again require all votes to be made in open session. The only exception in terms of roll call votes is when you're electing board officers. That can be done by secret ballot, but you still have to include the tally for each person. So you probably did that at your meeting last month. And an abstention vote is a no vote. So how Robert's Rules gets involved, it puts a limit on the order of voting, for example. That can be tricky. And this concept of allowing proxy or absentee voting or voting later if a question is tabled, that sort of stuff, we don't like because it's confusing. So best practices, make sure that we think high functioning boards have just good discussions at their board meetings. They're not fixated on rules and how to, you know, get over on one another by using some sort of parliamentary procedure. Board presidents are very important in this process then, because they're really the ones who are kind of controlling the flow of the meeting and all of that. They're the ones that are going to have to sit there and make the decision if somebody pulls out a hyper-technical rule. So we think keep motions simple. Like the agenda to include sample motions. So we don't think it's a sign of weakness for the board to be prepared to have sample motions that are right in your Spark data there, or have notes written out about what your motion might be. And in particular, Steve will talk about closed session. We've got a series of scripts that we like to send to boards to use. And you shouldn't be ashamed of using the script, which helps you get it right, because the technical compliance, what it looks like on paper in your minutes is important. So again, open discussion is not a negative, so long as it's not used to attack people or otherwise potentially put the board in precarious situations like bias and those sorts of things. And legally, it doesn't matter where the discussion occurs. We just have to have a question or motion duly made and seconded, and then we have to have action on whatever that is, even if it's restated after amendment. Okay.
Excellent. Again, there's a number if you have any questions. All right, closed and executive session. This really should be the exception, not the rule. We find both new and experienced board members, I think, like to go into closed session probably more than they should. We say it's the most violated section of the Act, question mark. I think you can take away the question mark. Yeah. It's easily the most violated section. Either it's not done correctly or we're going into closed session for reasons that we shouldn't. There's only two reasons to go into closed session. And those are for the prevention of needless injury to the reputation of an individual, and if the person has not requested a public meeting. So the first part is needless injury. Just because you're going to talk in a negative way about somebody doesn't necessarily mean you have enough to go into closed session. It has to be significant enough to be needless injury. And the other part is, if you're going to talk about that person, you have to notify them, hey, we're going to talk about you, we're going to go into closed session. Do you have any objection to that, or are you asking us to do this in a public meeting? Well, every once in a while, somebody will say, yeah, if you're going to talk about me, you're going to do it in the open. You're not going to do this in closed session. You have to stay in open session, and your choice at that point either is to talk about it in open session or don't talk about it at all. An individual cannot be a board member. We got this recent decision from the Attorney General. We're not sure we agree with it completely, but it is what it is. The AG enforces the Open Meetings Act. We don't. And so they've made clear when we're talking about an injury to a reputation, we're not talking about a board member. So if we're going to say something negative about a board member, that's being done in open session. And then the second reason is if the closed session is clearly necessary for the protection of the public interest. So what's the public interest? Typically, what we're talking about is money, really, pecuniary interest. So if you're negotiating a contract and the amount of that contract, obviously you don't want to do that in open session and give away the farm to whoever you're going to contract with. Looks like we have a question. Clarifying abstention votes. Is it actually a no vote, or does it just reduce the total number of votes considered for a majority? This one's so easy, I'll let one of these two answer.
Oh, there is nothing in the open meeting statute that tells us what an abstention really is. Well, go ahead. This was your section. I'm sorry. I'll keep my mouth
No,
shut.
I think an abstention is a no vote to the extent that we're counting to the number that we need for any particular board action, right? So if you have a board meeting where you have all 6 members there, you need 4 votes to have a majority. If you have a board meeting where you have 5 members there, you need 3 votes to have a majority vote. Some certain sections of the statute require supermajority votes, right? For example, it must be 2/3 of the full board, right, of the number of seats on the board. So really, for most of your basic stuff, a no vote just means it's going to be harder to get to 4 if you have 6 members, or 3 if you have 5 or 4 members. So it technically counts as a no vote.
So if you have 6 board members, 3 vote yes, 2 vote no, 1 votes abstain, the motion fails.
Right.
Because it's not been passed by a majority of a quorum of the board.
So it's strange, but the number that you have there for the quorum, I think this was Lynn that had, the number you have for the quorum in that meeting could dictate the effect of that abstention vote, right? If one of those no votes doesn't show up for the meeting and you have a 3-1-1 vote,
Now
then
you-
I think
now you've
that
gotta
motion
pass.
passes on a 5-member quorum. So it kind of is a no vote, it kind of is not, it depends.
You've answered her question. Nicely done. All right. And then the other thing about the public interest, it's not the board's interest unless they overlap. So we just like you can't go in for an individual board member, you can't go in for the board's interest. It's the public interest that we're looking at. So there are really only 6 reasons or 6 topics that are listed in the statute. Now it says in the statute, closed sessions may be held for, but shall not be limited to such reasons as, and they list the 6 reasons. If you're going to go with, but shall not be limited to, either be dead certain that it's lawful or talk to your lawyer, because we've had a lot of people that have gotten into trouble going into closed session for reasons that they shouldn't. So one, and this is one that schools actually use quite often, strategy sessions for collective bargaining, real estate purchases, pending litigation, or litigation which is imminent as evidenced by communications of a claim or threat of litigation to or by the public body. We also say, it says reasons not limited to, this could be contracts, contract negotiations. This time of the year, we're getting a lot of calls about principal contracts, superintendent contracts. I think portions of that could be done. They're very similar to the collective bargaining, and we're talking about negotiating a contract. I think those are going to be close enough and would be allowed in closed session. Another reason, discussing regarding deployment of, or discussions regarding deployment of security personnel or devices. Unfortunately, we have that every once in a while now. We used to never have it. Investigative proceedings regarding the allegations of criminal misconduct. Every once in a while, we'll have one of those. Evaluation of job performance of a person. Nowhere in here does it say personnel. But every time you guys call us, oh, don't worry, Steve, we've got personnel on the agenda. Personnel is not a proper agenda item, and it sure in the heck is not a reason to go into closed session. So get that out of your heads. Everybody does it, but just because they do it doesn't mean it's right. So what it actually says is evaluation of the job performance of a person, but only when it's necessary to prevent needless injury to their reputation. And again, if that person has not requested a public meeting. So what the Attorney General has told us is you're going to have a discussion about somebody's performance. Let's say you're evaluating the superintendent, because I've had a couple just this spring where I learned after the fact that they were conducted 100% in closed session. That's not appropriate. We have AG decisions that tell us if you're talking positive things, that has to be done in open session. It's only when we need to prevent the needless injury to the superintendent's reputation and the superintendent says, yeah, closed session's okay, that you can actually go into closed session. So in the AG's world, you could go in and out of closed session. It's only when something comes up that's going to needlessly injure somebody's reputation that you actually go into closed session. So you can see how limited that is. It frustrates us. We know it frustrates you. You can't have an open and frank conversation to evaluate somebody. At least that's the feeling we get, or the feedback we get from boards. But that's the rule, and that's what we're stuck with. There's 2 other exceptions of the 6. They're never going to apply to us. They don't even matter. So you get one of the exceptions, you can't discuss appointment or election of a new member in closed session. That all has to be done in open session. I think we touched on this a little bit. Closed sessions are inappropriate because a matter might arise. So if something negative might come up, that's not a reason to be in closed session. You only go into closed session when it actually arises.
So they're laughing at me because there was a discussion at the beginning about how much I'd be able to keep my mouth shut, and they said I wouldn't be able to, and I can't. But one thing I do want to point out here, again, it may sound like I'm dogging on Spark, and I really like that software. We can log in and adjust agendas, and I love that software actually. But one of the things I don't like about Spark is that the default is to have a closed session, like an agenda item that's called closed session on every meeting. Closed session is not an agenda item. What you're talking about in closed session is the agenda item. And you shouldn't have a closed session on every agenda just in case we want to go into closed session, because that's not a way to get into closed session. So.
All right, we got a question from Alan. On a staff member who has been placed on paid leave, why can the staff know the name but the board cannot? I think the number one reason is the staff wouldn't ultimately sit to decide if that person's employment may be terminated at some point. Really, that's the thing. We're trying to keep the board from being biased, and the less they know, the better.
And a staff member has a need to know that there's going to be a sub in the room, or somebody needs to cover coaching or whatever. There's really no need to know for the board in the short term when someone's been put on leave.
That's just the Attorney General's opinions that tell us that. Other possible permissible reasons to go into closed session, we think receiving legal advice, it's not on the list, but clearly you have an attorney-client privilege. If you discuss that in open session, you lose that privilege. So we're very confident that that would be allowed to be done in closed session. Non-collective bargaining contract negotiations, we touched on that a little bit. Pretty much any contract, especially when you're talking about price, that can be done in closed session. Protecting student confidences, that could be a reason. We put but why, and the same thing for staff confidences. Our question would be, why are you talking about it, period?
Yeah.
Now, there are occasions where a student discipline matter gets appealed up to the school board. In that case, yeah, you'd be talking about it, and you might have some discussions in closed session. That would be appropriate. But short of that, you really shouldn't be discussing it. Same with staff confidences. If you're evaluating them, you're supposed to give them notice, and they get a chance to be present in open session if that's how they want it to go. Short of that, we like to keep, again, the board members in the dark. I know it's the only corporation in the world where we run it this way, but the reason is they have to be unbiased if they're ever going to make a decision on that person's employment. It makes us uncomfortable, not on the list. And that, I would say probably half the time when we get calls, that's the real reason. It's not pleasant to do some of these things in open session. You don't want to, and we understand that, but that's not the law, and that's not one of the exceptions. Others, I'm sure as they come up, there can be other ones. Again, you look to see if they're similar to the ones that are on the list. We really don't have any court decisions or even any AG opinions or disposition letters that give us a whole lot of guidance on other topic areas.
And sometimes more than one might apply. So understand that sometimes combining 2 things together makes it so that the whole would be permissible.
All right, procedures. You have to take the vote to go into closed session while you're in open session. You have to record the entire motion. You have to record the vote of each member, and you have to put in the time when the closed session begins and ends. This was something they added in, and it trips people up still. If it passes, the president has to restate the limited subject matter for closed session and say that's all we're going to discuss in closed session. We hesitated to put this in. I hesitated to put this in. There is a court decision from the Nebraska Court of Appeals. It's now 20-some years old. What had happened in this case is they were talking about getting rid of the president, or the president was resigning. They then decided, hey, we need to have an interim. And so they discussed that in closed session, and then they came out and actually hired an interim. And somebody sued them and said that wasn't an appropriate, number one, it wasn't an appropriate agenda item. 2, it wasn't an appropriate closed session item. The Court of Appeals said, well, when you're talking about replacing a president, and you've got to have an interim, everybody knows that. Of course you're going to talk about an incidental matter like that. This makes us nervous. I know the AG does not like this, and I raised it in a response to a complaint, and they really didn't like it. It's there. I'd rather use it as a defense than as an offensive way of operating. So it's there, but please be very, very careful if you're going to try to go down that road.
Well, and you'll notice that it said versus Board of Regents. The fact of the matter is there are special rules for the University of Nebraska system.
Not in writing, but just because UNL's special.
All right. Lynn wants to know, should the minutes reflect that restatement by the president?
Yes. We'll show you here in a second, Lynn. We've got a sample of one of our scripts, but yes, absolutely. Because how else do you know that it happened?
Yeah.
Right.
You cannot take action in closed session. You have to reconvene in open session before taking any formal action. There's what formal action means. It's a collective decision or collective commitment or promise to make a certain decision or a certain action or making a certain policy. Formal action does not include negotiating guidance. This is probably the only exception given by members of the school board to either us as your lawyers or somebody else who's negotiating on your behalf, again, for contracts, collective bargaining, real estate purchases, things of that nature. So they'll go any, hey, we want to buy that real estate. Your range is 100,000 to 150,000. You don't have to come out in open session and announce that. Board members do have the right to challenge the continuation of closed session under two circumstances. One, if you think that they have exceeded the stated reason in the closed session motion, or if you think it's no longer clearly necessary either for the protection of the public interest or for the needless injury to an individual's reputation. It takes a majority vote of the members of the public body to overrule the challenge. Does the vote occur in or out of closed session? I think you have to come out of closed session and take that action because it says no action will be taken in closed session. The challenge and its results must be recorded in the minutes. We don't get this a whole lot.
Thank God.
But when we do, it's pretty contentious typically. Our recommendations, you've always done it that way. You got on the board, you're brand new, you're just doing it how they've always done it. Not the best way to do it. And I'd say, especially if you're new, go to these trainings, pay attention to the open meetings part. It's pretty simple once you've got it mastered, but there are some little quirks here and there. Use scripts when closed session is expected. It's very easy. We have scripts for pretty much anything that comes up. Here's an example for one of evaluating job performance and to get legal advice from your lawyer. There's the motion. You ask for a motion. It's moved and seconded. And then you can see there, after they go vote to go into closed session, you repeat this. And there it is. And we have, like I said, we have a variety of these for different things. We also have a checklist you can use for closed sessions.
And two real quick things. One, if you use Spark, we can go in and preload this. And number two, to Lynn's point, do you have to record the restated motion? If you have this script, you can just, somebody who has it can hand it right over to the secretary who's taking the minutes. And then they've actually got it to be able to type it all straight in there.
And finally, this came out of an attorney general's disposition letter. Essentially what they said is, in this case, was, hey, you called your lawyer and counted on them for their advice. And they took that into account when deciding, hey, are we going to push this on for any prosecution of any kind or do anything more drastic? And here, because they called the lawyer and had counted on the lawyer's advice, they kind of, I don't want to say they got a break, but they were given the benefit of the doubt in that situation. So if in doubt, call. You'll have that information and evidence available if anybody were to ever file a complaint.
We work really hard, all 5 of the attorneys at KSB, to be available, especially on board meeting nights. In fact, I don't know if you saw me quick texting. I had a board president text me as we were starting this webinar, and I just asked Cody to text the board president. It's our job to be available to you. A text that's going to cost, I mean, we do charge, but a text to us is going to be way cheaper in the moment than an open meetings complaint. So when in doubt, as a new board member, you can say, hey, Madam Board President, did you check with Bobby on that? Or is this something we should text about? I don't view that as, I mean, I think that's a cost savings thing for boards to do. This is Bobby. This is me.
This is me. Okay.
One of us is prepared.
So, God, when are you going to talk, Karen? Jeez. All right. So insurance and individual legal liability for board members. We get the question fairly often. We know what type of insurance coverage do we have on the board? For me and my, I'm signed up. I'm on the board now. I'm a member. I don't get paid a whole lot to be there, so I want to make, at least make sure that I'm not going to get sued. So we do have statutory provisions that allow the school board to purchase insurance, which indemnifies, covers liability issues and those sorts of things. both for board members and for employees of the school district. So if you haven't had the discussion yet about your insurance renewal, you will at some point as a new board member. If you're an existing board member, you can kind of help explain this. But boards in general have a couple of pretty good insurance options in Nebraska and that are fairly comprehensive in what they cover. So our purpose with this is not to get into all the specifics of exactly what's covered. You'll have plenty of time to go through that. But just to tell you that if you have questions in that process about whether something is or isn't covered, you've got the statutory authority to buy pretty much whatever insurance that you think is appropriate to indemnify or to prevent against liability. So check with your carrier coverage, ask the superintendent questions about, what is covered, how it's covered. They insurance carriers talk about things a little bit differently, but in general, there should be answers to most of your questions. More good news in this regard, and this is one that we get whenever we're doing like hot topics presentations and we talk about how board members got sued. There are actually very few times in state or federal law when an individual board member, both in your official or in your personal capacity, that sort of lawsuit might ever actually result in you as the person, the board member, paying money because of the, congratulations, you've been elected to the school board. One of those is if you employ a teacher without a certificate. And so this is straight from Nebraska statute. It talks about the inability to employ a teacher for the purpose of teaching, as that's defined if they don't have a certificate. And if you do, you could be personally liable for the money that you paid in salary and benefits to that teacher. The second is if you use, for personal reasons, something like the school's tax exemption. And we've had it happen several times where a board member orders something off of Amazon and it was through the school and it turns out the board member took that piece of equipment home or something like that. It could be intentional, it could be unintentional. But just understand that if you are getting a personal benefit from the use of the school's tax exemption, that is a problem. So, again, especially if you're a new board member, those purchasing procedures should be fairly clear, but that's a good question to ask.
It's not worth the risk of saving $20. It's also a crime and you can be charged criminally. And they are getting more and more interested in the wrongful use of those certificates. So please be careful.
Yep. Section 1983, that's a federal law that says if somebody acting under the color of the state does something which causes some sort of deprivation of rights or harm to another individual, that is something where you could have personal liability. And I don't know if you want to drop in, Steve, the case that we were talking about earlier.
Oh, we had a case out of the East Coast. Now I forget where it was from. Carolinas, maybe.
Somewhere south.
But it was politically motivated, and as I recall, Democrats had been in charge and Republicans got on board, or vice versa. And they were out to get employees who were rooting for or supporting the other side, and they intentionally violated people's rights and made very callous comments, and it was very clear that what their motive was, and so they were hit with some personal liability in the amounts of $100,000, $150,000, and so it's very, very rare, but it does happen.
Yeah. The last one that we'd highlight real quickly is especially under state tort law. So if you do something that causes damages, an intentional violation of a clearly established right. For example, I don't care that we have the First Amendment. We're going to punish every kid that says something we don't like. It is possible that could be both a Section 1983 and a Nebraska state law claim by that student or that teacher to exercise their First Amendment right. So if you know that you'd be violating the law by moving forward with that decision, seek legal advice, because
It's
we'll
going to
probably
be things like, we don't hire women.
Right.
We don't care. We don't hire African Americans. I mean, it's going to be something outrageous.
That's right. It has to be clearly established and you have to know it, right? So you probably know that students that mouth off, you don't get to punch them in the face, at least not east of Kearney. So if you are a board member and you're walking through the school with the principal someday and some kid spouts off and you punch him in the face, yeah, they can sue you personally for that because you know that kid has a right not to be hit in the face. So that's a silly example. But the long and short of it is, for the most part, you're probably either not potentially liable or you're covered by the district's insurance plans.
Okay, these last two, for those of you that are looking at your watches going, there's only 11 minutes left because I have to pee before our board meeting starts at 7. Don't worry, we will be done in time because number 4 and number 5 kind of flow together. And so one of the questions that I find myself talking to people as we're at conferences or see people in person is, Karen, I ran for the board because I had some folks in my neighborhood that wanted me to make some changes at the school, but now how do I deal with these folks when they want me to take action about that kindergarten teacher that's not doing a great job? or that basketball coach that isn't really good for kids. And there's nothing illegitimate at all about running for the board and wanting to see positive changes happen in your school community. The problem is what we can't have is an individual board member being like the conduit for unhappy people to get their complaints in front of the board. And so I'm just going to walk you through step by step what I think you should do as a high functioning board member into responding to patron complaints. And remember, this is not me telling you that you shouldn't hold people accountable and expect changes. This is me telling you how to get changes made. Okay. So step one, wherever you are, whatever school board you are on, your very first piece of homework for tonight is to go find your board's complaint policy. Every one of you somewhere has a policy on how to deal with patron complaints. If your school board happens to subscribe to our policy service, it's going to be policy number 2006. If you don't know if your board subscribes to our policy service, go look at 2006. And if it's a complaint procedure, good news. We write your policies for you. And if it's if you work on your own or you work with one of the other policy services, all of the services have a complaint policy. So that's step one, go find it. And then step two, I would print 50 copies.
Well, I would add a sub-step 1B, read it.
Yeah, that's true.
Because that will help you in a lot of cases know who to tell that person to go talk to. But yeah, sorry.
So when somebody grabs you at church or at the grocery store and says, you know, I don't want to cause problems, but, you know, the coach dropped the F-bomb on my kid and that's not okay. What you say, instead of saying, oh my gosh, I'll get right on it, or saying, kind of stiff-arming him and saying, I don't care about your kid, you say, you know what, I happen to have this right here. This is the process that you're supposed to follow when you've got a problem with a coach. This is how I can help you, so that you're actually being responsive to someone that has a complaint. I would hand it out freely. Now, if your veteran board members are sitting in a room with you going, oh, holy crap, then we'll get a lot of complaints, that's good. I mean, to run things through the process is better than doing everything like through the good old boy network, right? It's better to have complaints out in the open and then follow that process. Most of the complaint policies out there say that people with complaints should start by talking to the teacher or to the coach. And then if they're not happy, they work up to the principal. And then if they're not happy, go to, work up through the chain of command. Now, what people will say back is, I don't want my kid to have a teacher take out revenge on my kid for me filing a complaint. And here's what I say back to those parents. The best way to teach your kid how to handle life's up and downs is to model how to handle conflict. And the best way to handle conflict is to start by going to the person with whom you have a problem. If you want to go to the Bible, you can go to the book of Ephesians that tells you to do exactly this. If you're not so much with the Bible, you can go to like psychology textbooks, but all good advice on how to handle conflict says, start by respectfully articulating your concerns to the person you have a problem with.
Karen, we need to talk.
I mean, I just firmly believe that one of the reasons our kids don't handle conflict well is we don't model it for them. And so walking hand in hand with people in your community who have concerns to show them how to do this, like seriously, I believe we're making change in the world for good. So now this is what you say to the patron that has the complaint. After you're done with that person, what I want you to do is text the superintendent and say, hey, I just gave Bobby Truey a copy of the complaint policy. He's really ticked off that Steve Williams dropped the F-bomb on his kid at practice. So you give the administrators a heads up of what's cooking. And then you hold the superintendent accountable for following up on personnel things, because he or she is the person that you as the board member get to boss around. If your patron says, I'm not going to follow the complaint policy, then you very respectfully say, I'm sorry, then I don't think I can help you, because if you can't follow the process, then I can't do anything for you. Don't make promises to look into it, because then that person is going to hold you responsible for solving their problem. So once you talk to the patron, give them the complaint process, give the administrators a heads up, then you stay out of it unless it comes to you through the process as a board member. Again, this is not me trying to cut you off at the legs. This is me trying to show you how to be effective as a board in making changes that you want made.
Chris wants to know about policy updates. When will new recommendations for updates be published?
We send our updates out in May/June, depending on when the unicameral finishes whatever insanity it is going to do this session. And then we scramble to get updates written.
So typically, and it's the same for most of the services. You got to wait to see what the unicameral does. So that is going to run us well into June this year, I think, in particular. But we try to, by the time we get down to the last few days of the session, you kind of know what else might be coming. So we can start to work mid-May on those. It really just depends on how much crazy stuff passes and federal changes. So we have a big batch of potential Title IX things to sort through coming up. But I think our timeline will still be about the same. So if you're a new board member, expect in June and July that you could have a fairly substantial amount of policy changes to make, even if your school does a good job of keeping up on those regularly. So by your June meeting, we're hoping.
The other thing we want you to know that board members may or may not know that have been on the board before, if you are a service subscriber, we do a webinar like this where we walk through all the policy updates. And board members, you're welcome to zoom in on that, to listen to it, or to watch the recording, because we really do want you to understand the policies that we're recommending that you adopt. Okay, last thing. Oh, I hope you can read this cartoon because it was hilarious to me. It's a dog who's working for the fire department, and it says, Jake is torn between upholding his responsibility to the community and satisfying his canine urges. Come on, that's funny. So the last little bit I want to talk about is what your role and responsibilities are as a school board member. And again, I have served on charitable foundation boards. I've served on church boards. I don't think there is any job more frustrating in some regards than being a board member, because so much of what we tell you is defer to the administration. You don't get to make that decision because we set you up as judge and jury in all personnel decisions. And so that's why you don't want the judge of a criminal trial at the crime scene investigating the murder, right? And so we have to keep you that kind of distance apart from some of the stuff that happens in your school buildings, because we need you to be able to make the decision when push comes to shove and it's time to put something in front of the board. And I apologize for that. I know that it's very frustrating to have us constantly tell you that, but understand that we're telling you to keep away from some of those decisions, not to keep you from doing your job, but to enable you to do your job. So one of the things that I talk to administrators all the time is the difference between oversight and micromanagement. Your job as a board member is to provide oversight to what's happening. And I love this definition, watchful and responsible care. If you don't understand documents that are sliding past you at a board meeting, it is not micromanagement to say, wait, hold on a second, I don't understand these budget numbers. That's your job, and there's nothing wrong with that. Micromanagement is when you want to have control over every little part. So not that we agree to have you resurface the gym floor, but I want to talk about what kind of chemical you're going to put on the gym floor. That's the difference between oversight and micromanagement. So high functioning boards provide a lot of oversight, but they do not micromanage. High functioning administrators welcome oversight, but they gently push back when they believe board members are pushing into micromanagement. And that's the tightrope that you have to walk as a newly elected board member. So in statute, these are the jobs that the law has given you. You have to provide the facilities. You're supposed to provide it in good condition. You're supposed to keep an accurate budget. You're supposed to establish policy. You are technically the employer of all certificated staff, although you don't get to do all of the initial interviewing. You ultimately are the body that employs that person. And then you boss the superintendent around. Those are operationally what a school board does under Nebraska law. The administrator's jobs statutorily are to evaluate and discipline certificated staff. Unless you hold a supervisory certificate, you as a board member are not qualified to evaluate a teacher, even though you all know instinctually what good teaching is. Only an administrator can do that. Only the administration is the one that recommends the continued employment or the ending of the employment of a teacher. And then the superintendent's responsible for filing budget documents after you approve it as the board. Operationally, the administration carries out board policy. They boss all the staff. You boss the superintendent, and then he or she bosses all the staff. And then they oversee the operation of the school in all areas. Your most important decision as a board member is hiring the superintendent, setting the goals that he or she is supposed to pursue, and holding him or her accountable. And really, again, I have the pleasure of working with many of your boards that are extraordinarily high functioning. Really good boards do that with passion and fervor. And then they let the superintendent go forth and make the decisions that they have to make to actually execute the goals that you've set. And then superintendents who are listening, I view part of your job is to provide leadership and development for the board and to welcome the board when they're giving you that oversight. You know, you don't want board members just to be quiet and vote yes on everything. What we really need is for boards to fulfill their obligations to provide that oversight and for administrators to provide the leadership and development for the board to do that. Okay, so your role, board members, is the what. You know the community's vision, you know the values. Your job is to set the policies and tell the board generally what, or tell the administration what you want accomplished. The administration's role is the how, the strategies, the techniques, and the tactics. So hiring and firing, we've talked about. Purchasing, we kind of like telling superintendents that they can spend up to X amount of money and then everything else has to go through the board. I personally think that limit should be probably lower than some superintendents want it to be. Because if you're spending public dollars, I think the voters have a right to hold the board accountable to how you spend your money. So board members, I think you should be looking at purchases. This is a fun one. If somebody wants to offer a $5 million piece of land, it would seem like a no-brainer that the superintendent should be able to say yes. But what if that land has, you know, old gas tanks on it? What if it has a decrepit building on it? And so we say that the board should accept gifts over a certain value so that the board has the chance to make sure that that's consistent with your strategic vision.
One quick thing I would say on that is when we do board trainings, and I really enjoy those, we get it, especially if you're somebody that uses our policies, we can go to several specific areas in the policies where the board has made a decision. Now that decision might predate you, especially if you're a new board member, but please understand that you have a policy, probably from whichever service you get it from, that says the superintendent hires and fires all classified staff members and appoints and takes away appointments of extra duty sponsorships, football coach, volleyball coach. So that is somewhere in your policy probably, because designating that to the superintendent is an act of legal significance. And so understanding what some of these red area policies actually say will alleviate some heartache when you know that, okay, I think the basketball coach should be fired. Well, that technically would take an entire change of policy to do that, right? And so understanding kind of how the structure is in place before you set off to accomplish the thing that you feel passionate about will make it so that you, I think, have a better chance of getting clear answers on how the process works. And so there are certain areas where I would recommend finding some of that stuff.
Yep, I totally agree. I think the policy work is not boring if you do it well. If you do it well, it's how you run the school as a board. Okay, so we are 2 minutes over, so I'm just going to say one last thing, and then we're going to let you go get ready for your board meeting. Boards, we work for you. I mean, we talk to the administrators most often, and I love we have great people to work with on the administrative core, but we are your lawyer. Our job is to make things easier for boards of education. And one of the things I think is missing sometimes for boards is like easy, accessible board training. So we're going to try to step into that gap and do some of that for you. So if you would, we really crave your feedback. You're going to get an email with a survey. Superintendents that forwarded the link onto your boards, if you would forward that on to everybody that participated. We really want to know if this is a model that you guys want moving forward, and if so, how we can make it better, because we really respect the work that boards do, and we think you do a really hard job for no money with not much guidance, and so we're going to try to help fill that gap.
We got one last question. Can a board president text the school's lawyer even while they're in closed session to ask legal advice? Yes, absolutely.
Happens all the time.
And in fact, we like text messaging in particular because, number one, we can do it without you having to step out and call. But it's a quick and easy way to get legal advice. And even if we're doing something like this, we could respond by a text real quick.
The other thing is I screenshot that so that if somebody files a complaint and I've given you bad advice, I take the blame, not you. So that's why I love that texting process. Okay, 6:53. Thank you all for participating. Stay warm, and we will see you down the road.